NFL owners are in absolute panic mode right now, and I'm not talking about the usual off-season chaos. John Harbaugh, one of the most respected coaches in football, just made moves that have the entire league scrambling. And when you connect the dots between what he's demanding, where he might be headed, and who he might be coaching, this whole thing starts looking like something none of us saw coming. Because buried in all these contract negotiations and coaching rumors, there's one name that keeps popping up that changes everything: Shedeur Sanders. Now, before you click off thinking this is just another hot take, listen to what's actually happening. Shannon Sharpe and Chad Johnson just broke down Harbaugh's full list of demands on their show, and the numbers are wild. $20 million per year, a $10 million staff budget, total authority over the roster, and here's the kicker: he wants to pick his own general manager, not work with the existing GM, not have input. He wants to select his own guy. Most people hear that and think Harbaugh's lost his mind. But when you look at what team is desperate enough to give him all of that, and when you look at what quarterback situation would make those demands make sense, everything points to Cleveland and Shedeur Sanders. And that's where this gets uncomfortable for a lot of people in the league. Let me walk you through how we got here, because none of this happens in a vacuum. The Browns have been a disaster for 2 decades. Everyone knows this. They've cycled through coaches like it's a revolving door. They've drafted quarterbacks who never panned out. They've made desperate moves that blew up in their faces. And the biggest disaster of all, the Deshaun Watson trade. Cleveland gave up multiple first-round picks. They handed out the biggest guaranteed contract in NFL history, $230 million fully guaranteed. They restructured their entire organization around acquiring one player, and it failed spectacularly. Watson got injured. He played terribly when he was on the field. The whole thing became a cautionary tale about what happens when desperation drives your decision-making. But here's what people aren't talking about enough. That failure taught Jimmy Haslam and the Browns front office a lesson, a painful, expensive, public lesson. You can't just throw money at a problem and hope it fixes itself. You can't interfere from the ownership level and expect coaches to succeed. You can't keep firing people every 2 years and wonder why nobody good wants the job. So when John Harbaugh walks in with this list of demands that would have been laughed out of the building 5 years ago, Cleveland's actually in a position where they might say yes, because they learned the hard way that their way doesn't work. Now let's talk about the demands themselves and why they matter specifically for Shedeur Sanders. $20 million per year puts Harbaugh in the same category as Andy Reid. That's elite money. That's Hall of Fame coach money. And Shannon Sharpe pointed out something critical when he was breaking this down. Andy Reid has earned every penny of that with 6 Super Bowl appearances, 3 wins, 6 straight AFC championship games. Harbaugh's resume, 1 Super Bowl win back in 2013. That's over a decade ago. But here's what Harbaugh knows. In today's NFL market, especially with teams desperate for proven leadership, he can command that number. And more importantly, the teams willing to pay it are the teams desperate enough to give him everything else on his list. That's not arrogance. That's understanding leverage. The $10 million staff budget is where this gets really interesting for Shedeur. Shannon broke it down perfectly. You need to pay your offensive coordinator somewhere between $1 and $1.5 million. Your defensive coordinator, same thing, maybe up to $2 million depending on who you get. Then you've got position coaches, quality control staff, analysts, the whole operation. $10 million sounds like a lot until you realize what it actually takes to build a championship-caliber coaching staff. And think about what that means for a young quarterback. If Harbaugh can go out and hire the absolute best offensive coordinator in the business, someone who specializes in developing young quarterbacks, someone who understands modern passing concepts, someone who can build an offense around Shedeur's strengths, his quick release, his accuracy, his ability to process information pre-snap, that changes everything. Remember, Harbaugh won his Super Bowl with Joe Flacco. Not exactly an offensive genius, but Harbaugh knew what it took to support a quarterback and put him in position to succeed. With a $10 million staff budget, he can hire coordinators who specialize in quarterback development in a way Baltimore never could afford. Total authority over the roster, this is huge. Shannon said it perfectly. Harbaugh didn't say he'd like to have some input. He said total authority over the final 53-man roster. That means Harbaugh gets to decide who stays and who goes. No front office interference. No owner meddling. His team, his decisions. For Shedeur, this is massive. It means Harbaugh can build the team around protecting his young quarterback. He can draft offensive linemen. He can sign veteran receivers. He can construct a running game that takes pressure off Shedeur while he's learning. He doesn't have to fight with a GM who wants to draft defensive players or skill position guys that don't fit the system. Every single roster decision can be made with one question in mind. Does this help Shedeur Sanders develop into a franchise quarterback? And then there's the GM selection. This might be the most important piece of the whole thing. If Harbaugh can pick his own general manager, he's going to pick someone who shares his vision for building around a young quarterback. Someone who understands that you don't just throw a rookie into the fire and hope for the best. Someone who's willing to invest resources, draft picks, free agent money, coaching staff, into creating the perfect environment for quarterback development. Now, Unk made a point during that conversation that's absolutely critical to understanding why this matters. He said Harbaugh knows that in order to win, you've got to have a quarterback. You're not going to win a Super Bowl like you did before where you get Flacco. He gets hot down the stretch, plays great for 4 or 5 games, and you have an outstanding defense to back him up. That's over. You need that guy. Listen to that carefully. Harbaugh knows the league has changed. He knows you can't win with game managers anymore. He knows you need an elite quarterback to compete for championships in today's NFL. So when Harbaugh looks at the landscape and sees Cleveland with Shedeur-Sanders, what does he see? He sees a young quarterback with legitimate talent who's been thrown into a chaotic situation. He sees a quarterback who was battle-tested at Colorado under his father's coaching. He sees a quarterback who's used to pressure, used to media attention, used to high expectations. And most importantly, he sees a quarterback who hasn't been destroyed by bad coaching yet. That last part is critical. Shedeur's only played a handful of games in the NFL. He's still moldable, he's still developing. He hasn't picked up bad habits from years of playing in a terrible system. For a coach like Harbaugh, that's the dream scenario. Give me a talented young quarterback. Give me total control to build the team around him. Give me the resources to hire the best staff in football. That's not a rebuild, that's an opportunity. But let's back up and talk about Shedeur's situation in Cleveland, because this is where things get uncomfortable. From what we've seen based on the footage and the timeline, the way Shedeur's been handled raises questions, not accusations, questions. He was drafted to be the future. Everyone knew that. The front office knew it. The coaching staff knew it. The fans knew it. But the way things played out, the way the depth chart was managed, the way playing time was distributed early on, it didn't always look like a team committed to developing their franchise quarterback. This isn't about making excuses, this is about context. Two things can be true at once. Shedeur can have areas he needs to improve, and the organization can have failed to put him in the best position to succeed. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. When you look at how other young quarterbacks around the league have been developed, there's usually a clear plan. There's usually consistency. There's usually an offensive system built specifically around their strengths. From what we've seen in Cleveland, that hasn't always been the case, and that's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's worth discussing. The media reaction to all of this has been all over the place. Some people are killing Harbaugh for his demands, saying he's asking for too much, saying no team in their right mind would give one coach that much power. Other people are defending him, saying this is exactly what Cleveland needs, saying if you want a proven winner, you've got to give him the tools to win. And then there's the Shedeur angle. Some media members have been quick to criticize him, pointing to stats, pointing to losses, pointing to moments where things didn't go well. But how many of those same people have actually broken down the context around those performances? How many have talked about the offensive line situation? How many have talked about the supporting cast? How many have talked about whether the play calling actually put him in position to succeed? This raises questions about how young quarterbacks are evaluated, because it's easy to look at the surface level numbers and make a judgment. It's harder to actually watch the film, understand the scheme, recognize when a quarterback is making the right reads but the protection breaks down or the receiver runs the wrong route. Unk and Acho talked about this on their show. They mentioned that personally they would love to see Coach Harbaugh coach Shedeur-Sanders simply because of his resume, what he's done for Lamar Jackson. Many people thought Lamar wasn't a quarterback, believe it or not. Harbaugh was able to align a roster to better equip Lamar's skill set, and the thinking is he would do the same with Shedeur. That's not a crazy idea. That's actually a really smart observation. Harbaugh has a track record of adapting his system to his quarterback's strengths. He doesn't force square pegs into round holes. He figures out what his quarterback does well and builds around that. For a young quarterback like Shedeur who's still figuring out the NFL level, that kind of coaching could be the difference between reaching his potential and becoming another what-if story. But here's where the NFL owners come into this. When you've got a Super Bowl winning coach putting out demands this specific, this detailed, this aggressive, he's sending a message to every team in the league. If you want me, this is what it's going to take. And if you're not willing to give me what I need, don't waste my time. That kind of leverage shifts the entire coaching market. Other coaches who are up for jobs start thinking, if Harbaugh's getting $20 million in total control, what should I be asking for? Teams that were planning to lowball their next coaching hire start realizing they might have to pay more than they thought. the whole ecosystem gets disrupted. And for owners who have been used to having control, who have been used to interfering, who have been used to thinking they know better than the football people, Harbaugh's demands are a direct challenge. Either you're serious about winning and you're willing to give up control to someone who knows what they're doing, or you're not. There's no middle ground. Cleveland's in a unique position here. The Ravens are on the hook for $34 million of Harbaugh's current contract, which means Cleveland would only need to add about $6 million to get to that $20 million number. Shannon said it perfectly. You just got to add 6 to the pot. That's it. You're good to go. And if adding $6 million gets you a Hall of Fame coach who's willing to bet his entire legacy on developing your young quarterback, you write that check so fast your hand cramps. The $10 million staff budget after what Cleveland spent on the Watson disaster, that's pocket change. Total roster control, after years of front office interference destroying coaches, that's exactly what they need. Selecting his own GM, after the current front office survived the Watson trade somehow, Cleveland needs a fresh start anyway. Everything Harbaugh's demanding is exactly what Cleveland needs to finally get it right. And everything Harbaugh's demanding is exactly what Harbaugh-Sanders needs to reach his potential. Now let's talk about the pressure and expectations, because this is where things get complicated. Shedeur came into the league with more attention than most rookies. His father's Sanders. He played at Colorado, where every game was a media spectacle. He's used to cameras, used to criticism, used to people doubting him. But the NFL is different. The scrutiny is different. The stakes are different. And when you're drafted by a franchise as desperate as Cleveland, the pressure multiplies. Every throw gets analyzed. Every mistake gets magnified. Every loss becomes a referendum on whether you're the guy or not. From what we've seen, Shedeur's handled that pressure about as well as you could expect. He's been composed, he's been patient, he hasn't lashed out at criticism, he's kept his head down and worked. That's not nothing, that's actually really important for a young quarterback in a tough situation. But composure and work ethic alone aren't enough if the organization isn't set up to support you. And that's what makes the Harbaugh situation so critical. Because if Cleveland actually gives Harbaugh everything he's asking for, it would signal a fundamental shift in how they operate. It would mean they're finally serious about building a championship organization instead of just hoping things magically get better. The fan reaction to all of this has been intense. Browns fans are starving for hope. They've watched their team fail for so long that any sign of competence feels like a miracle. Some fans are all in on Shedeur, defending every performance, arguing that he hasn't been given a fair shot. Other fans are more skeptical, pointing to the losses, wondering if he's really the answer. And then there's the Harbaugh factor. Some fans love the idea of bringing in a proven winner, someone with a Super Bowl ring, someone who commands respect. Other fans worry about giving one person that much power, especially after they just watched the Deshaun Watson experiment blow up. But here's the thing about fan reactions. They're emotional, they're based on hope and fear in equal measure, and that's okay. That's what makes sports compelling. But when you step back and look at this objectively, when you look at what Harbaugh's demanding and what Shedeur needs, the fit actually makes sense. Harbaugh needs a quarterback he can develop from the ground up. He needs a young talent who hasn't been ruined by bad coaching. He needs someone who's mentally tough enough to handle the pressure of playing in Cleveland. Shedeur checks all those boxes. Shedeur needs a coach with credibility. He needs someone who's won at the highest level. He needs someone who won't panic when things get tough. He needs an organization that's actually committed to building the right way instead of making desperate short-term moves. If Cleveland gives Harbaugh what he's asking for, that checks all those boxes. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Some people are going to say this is all speculation. Some people are going to say there's no proof Harbaugh's demands are specifically about coaching Shedeur. And you know what? They're right. We don't have confirmation. We don't have leaked texts or secret meetings or insider information. What we have is a timeline. We have Harbaugh putting out very specific demands. We have Cleveland in desperate need of both a coach and a plan for their young quarterback. We have media members like Shannon Sharpe and Chad Johnson connecting these dots on their platform. We have the context of how Cleveland operates and what they've learned from their failures. This isn't about claiming to know what's happening behind closed doors. This is about looking at the public information, the media discussions, the patterns, and recognizing that something significant might be developing. And even if nothing comes of it, even if Harbaugh ends up somewhere else and Cleveland goes in a different direction, the conversation itself is worth having, because it highlights what Shedeur needs. It highlights what Cleveland needs. It highlights how the coaching market works and what it takes to actually build a winning organization in today's NFL. There's also the question of whether Cleveland's ownership has actually learned their lesson. Jimmy Haslam has a history of interfering. He's fired coaches after 1 or 2 years. He's made impulsive decisions. The Watson trade was the ultimate example of that. So even if Harbaugh demands total control, even if Cleveland agrees on paper, will they actually follow through when things get tough? That's a fair question, and it's one of the reasons why Harbaugh's demands are so specific. He's not just asking for control in theory, he's asking for it in writing. He's asking for the authority to make roster decisions without interference. He's asking to pick his own GM so there's no power struggle. He's structuring these demands in a way that makes it harder for an owner to meddle. But will that be enough? Only time would tell. And that's part of what makes this situation so fascinating. Because if Cleveland actually gives Harbaugh everything he's asking for, and if Harbaugh actually takes the job, and if they actually commit to developing Shedeur the right way, it would represent a fundamental shift in how one of the league's most dysfunctional franchises operates. And if it works, if Harbaugh molds Shedeur into a franchise quarterback, if they build a consistent winner in Cleveland, that changes everything. It validates Harbaugh's approach. It proves that you can't cut corners when building a championship team. It shows other organizations what it actually takes to develop a young quarterback. But if it doesn't work, if Shedeur struggles, if the wins don't come, then Cleveland's back to square one, except now they've given away all their leverage and control to a coach who failed. The stakes couldn't be higher. Let's talk about what Shedeur's actually shown on the field, because that matters. From the footage we've seen, there are flashes. There are throws that make you understand why he was drafted. There are moments where he's processing information quickly, getting the ball out on time, making reads that rookie quarterbacks aren't supposed to make. But there have also been struggles. There have been games where the offense couldn't get going. There have been turnovers. There have been moments where he's looked overwhelmed. And that's normal for a young quarterback, especially one in a chaotic situation. But it also means there's legitimate work to be done. This isn't a situation where you just plug in a coach and everything magically gets better. What Shedeur needs is consistency. He needs the same system, the same terminology, the same philosophy for more than a few weeks at a time. He needs an offensive line that can protect him. He needs receivers who can get open. He needs a running game that keeps defenses honest. And he needs coaching that puts him in position to succeed rather than forcing him to overcome bad situations constantly. That's where Harbaugh comes in, because if you look at his track record, he's built those kinds of environments before. He's put quarterbacks in position to succeed. He's adapted his scheme to fit his personnel. He's shown he can develop talent at the position. But there's also the question of whether Harbaugh's offensive philosophy is the right fit for Shedeur. Harbaugh's traditionally been known for running the football, playing good defense, and asking his quarterback to manage the game rather than carry the team. Is that the right approach for a young quarterback who came from Colorado's wide-open passing attack? Maybe, maybe not, but here's the thing. Harbaugh's also shown he can adapt. Look at what he did with Lamar Jackson. When Lamar took over, Harbaugh completely redesigned the offense. He built around Lamar's unique skill set. He didn't try to force Lamar to be a traditional pocket passer. He maximized what Lamar did well. Could he do the same with Shedeur? Could he build an offense that uses Shedeur's quick processing, his accuracy, his ability to throw from the pocket while also protecting him with a strong running game and good defense? That's the bet Cleveland would be making. And that's the bet Shedeur would be betting his career on. Because if this doesn't work, if the next few years don't show significant development, the narrative around him changes. Instead of being a young quarterback who needs time and support, he becomes a bust. Instead of being a victim of organizational dysfunction, he becomes part of the problem. That's not fair, but that's how the NFL works. Quarterbacks get blamed when things go wrong even when they're not the main issue. And for Shedeur, who's already dealing with the baggage of being Dayan's son, who's already dealing with people questioning whether he can handle the NFL, the margin for error is smaller than it is for other quarterbacks. So when we talk about Harbaugh's demands, when we talk about the money and the control and the staff budget, we're really talking about whether Cleveland's willing to give Shedeur the best possible chance to succeed. Because that's what all of those demands add up to. They're not about ego. They're not about a coach wanting power for power's sake. They're about creating an environment where a young quarterback can actually develop. Now let's talk about the timeline and how things have unfolded, because that context matters. When Cleveland drafted Shedeur, the expectation was that he'd sit and learn. Maybe play late in the season if things went poorly, but from what we've seen, that's not exactly how it played out. He got thrown into action earlier than expected. The offensive line struggled. The play calling was inconsistent. The supporting cast didn't always execute. And through all of that, Shedeur had to learn on the fly. He had to figure out NFL defenses while also dealing with organizational chaos. He had to develop timing with receivers while also worrying about whether his offensive line could protect him for more than 2 seconds. That's a tough ask for any rookie. And while Shedeur's shown toughness and resilience, it's fair to ask whether the organization did enough to set him up for success. Not whether they guaranteed success, that's not possible, but whether they created an environment where a young quarterback has the best chance to grow. And based on what we've seen, based on the media reports, based on the way things have unfolded, there are legitimate questions about whether Cleveland did that. Not accusations, not conspiracy theories, just questions. Which brings us back to Harbaugh. Because if he comes in with total control, if he gets to build the roster, if he gets to hire his own staff, if he gets to pick his own GM, those questions go away. There's no more ambiguity about who's in charge. There's no more confusion about the organizational philosophy. There's just one person with a clear vision and the authority to execute it. For Shedeur, that could be exactly what he needs. Instead of trying to figure out what 5 different people want from him, he'd have one voice, one system, one plan. And if that plan is built around developing him into a franchise quarterback, if every decision is made with that goal in mind, his chances of succeeding go way up. But it also means the pressure on Shedeur increases. Because if Cleveland gives Harbaugh everything he wants and builds the organization around developing Shedeur and it still doesn't work, there's nowhere left to point fingers. The excuses run out. The what-ifs disappear. It either works or it doesn't. And that's a scary proposition for a young quarterback. But it's also the only way to actually find out what you've got. You can't evaluate a quarterback fairly when the organization around him is a mess. You can't judge his potential when he's constantly having to overcome dysfunction. At some point, you have to create a stable environment and see what happens. That's what Harbaugh's demands represent. The chance to create that stable environment. The chance to actually build something sustainable instead of constantly putting band-aids on broken systems and hopping for different results. The media cycle around all of this has been intense. Every day there's a new report. Every day someone has an opinion. Every day the narrative shifts slightly. And for Shedeur, that's got to be exhausting. Because he's trying to focus on football, trying to improve, trying to prove he belongs, while also dealing with constant speculation about his future, his coach's future, the organization's direction. That's part of playing in the NFL, especially for a quarterback in a high-profile situation. But it doesn't make it easier. And it's worth acknowledging that the mental side of the position, the ability to block out noise and focus on what you can control, that's just as important as the physical tools. From what we've seen, Shedeur's handled that aspect well. He hasn't gotten into social media battles. He hasn't fired back at critics publicly. He's kept his composure even when things haven't gone well. That maturity, that mental toughness, that's a good sign, because the NFL is brutal. The criticism is relentless. And if you can't handle that, if you let it get in your head, you're done. But even the mentally toughest quarterback needs support, needs coaching, needs an organization that's actually committed to his development. And that's what this whole Harbaugh situation is really about. It's about whether Cleveland's finally ready to provide that support, whether they're finally ready to build the right way instead of making desperate moves and hopping for miracles. The comparison to the Deshaun Watson situation keeps coming up. And it's worth digging into. Cleveland was desperate for a quarterback. They saw Watson as the answer. They threw everything at him, not thinking about the long-term consequences, not thinking about whether it was actually the right move, just thinking about the short-term hope of finally having a franchise quarterback. And it blew up, spectacularly, publicly, expensively, in every way possible. It failed. So now Cleveland's in a position where they should have learned from that mistake. They should understand that desperation leads to bad decisions. They should know that you can't just throw money at a problem and hope it fixes itself. But have they actually learned? Or will they make the same mistake again, just in a different form? Will they get desperate about coaching? Will they overpay for Harbaugh and give him too much control without actually understanding what they're signing up for? Will they repeat the same pattern, just with a coach instead of a quarterback? That's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. Because everyone wants to believe that failure teaches lessons. Everyone wants to believe that organizations get smarter after making huge mistakes. But history suggests that's not always true. Sometimes organizations just keep making different versions of the same mistake over and over again. For Shedeur, that uncertainty has to be frustrating, because his future is tied to whether Cleveland actually learned from the Watson disaster. His development depends on whether the organization can actually build something sustainable. His career trajectory might be determined by whether Jimmy Haslam can actually step back and let football people make football decisions. That's a lot of variables that Shedeur can't control, and that's what makes this situation so complicated. Because even if Shedeur does everything right, even if he develops exactly the way he should, even if he becomes the quarterback Cleveland hopes he can be, it might not matter if the organization around him is still dysfunctional. And that's where Harbaugh's demands become so important, because they're specifically designed to remove organizational dysfunction. They're specifically structured to give one person the authority to build it the right way. They're specifically intended to create stability and consistency. If Cleveland agrees to those demands, if they actually follow through, it removes a lot of those variables. It gives Shedeur a real chance. It gives the organization a real chance. It gives everyone involved the best possible opportunity to succeed. But if Cleveland balks at those demands, if they try to negotiate them down, if they agree to them but don't actually follow through, then nothing changes. The dysfunction continues. The coaching carousel keeps spinning, and Shedeur becomes another young quarterback whose career was wasted by organizational failure. So where does all this leave us? We've got a Hall of Fame coach making demands that would fundamentally reshape how a franchise operates. We've got a young quarterback who needs exactly the kind of environment those demands would create. We've got an organization that should have learned from past mistakes but might not have. We've got media members connecting dots and asking questions. We've got fans desperate for hope but scared to believe. And we don't have answers, we don't have confirmation, we don't have inside information. What we have is a situation that raises more questions than it answers. What we have is a timeline that suggests something significant might be developing. What we have is context that makes this entire scenario make sense even if nothing ultimately comes of it. Because whether Harbaugh ends up in Cleveland or not, whether he coaches Shedeur or not, the conversation itself reveals something important. It reveals what it actually takes to develop a young quarterback in today's NFL. It reveals what kind of organizational commitment is required to build a winner. It reveals how the power dynamics between coaches, front offices, and ownership actually work. And for Shedeur, it reveals just how complicated his situation really is. How many factors outside his control will determine whether he succeeds or fails. How much the organization around him matters. How critical the next few decisions are to his entire career. This isn't a story with a clean ending. This isn't a situation where we can wrap everything up and say, here's what's going to happen. This is messy, this is uncertain, this is uncomfortable, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the fact that we're asking these questions, that we're having these conversations, that we're examining whether Cleveland's actually committed to doing this right, maybe that's what matters most. Because if Cleveland doesn't get this right, if they don't give Harbaugh what he needs or they don't commit to developing Shedeur properly, we'll be having this exact same conversation in 2 years about the next coach and the next young quarterback. The cycle will continue, the dysfunction will persist, and another talented player's career will be wasted. But if they do get it right, if they actually give Harbaugh total control, if they actually build around Shedeur the way a franchise should build around their young quarterback, then maybe, just maybe, Cleveland finally breaks the cycle. Maybe they finally figure out what every other successful organization already knows, that you can't shortcut the process, that you have to invest in coaching and infrastructure, in creating an environment where young players can actually develop. So we're left with questions. Will Cleveland give Harbaugh what he's demanding? Will Harbaugh actually take the job if they do? Will those demands translate into actual support for Shedeur? Will the organization follow through, or will they fall back into old patterns? And most importantly, does Shedeur have what it takes to become a franchise quarterback if he's actually given the right environment? We don't know yet, and that's uncomfortable. But that's where we are. That's the reality of this situation. Uncertain, complicated, full of potential but also full of risk. And all we can do is watch how it unfolds and see whether Cleveland finally learned their lesson or whether they're destined to repeat the same mistakes they've been making for 20 years.